Section 27 of the Arabian Nights Entertainments, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 27. The Arabian Nights Entertainments, Volume 2, by Anonymous. Translated by Dr. Jonathan Scott, 1754 to 1829. The story of the lives of Kummir Al Zummaun, Prince of the Isle of the Children of Khaledan, and of Badoura, Princess of China, Part 8. Hitherto Kummir Al Zummaun, the captain, and his men had not said a word to one another. At last the prince asked the captain, whom he knew again, why they had taken him away by force. The captain in his turn demanded of the prince whether he was not a debtor of the king of Arabian. "I, the king of Arabian's debtor," replied the prince in amazement. "I do not know him, and have never set foot in his kingdom," the captain answered. "You should know that better than I. You will talk to him yourself in a little while. Till then, stay here and have patience." The captain was not long on his voyage back to the Isle of Arabian. Though it was night when he cast anchor in the port, he landed immediately, and taking his prisoner with him, hastened to the palace, where he demanded to be introduced to the king. The Princess Badoura had withdrawn into the inner palace, but as soon as she heard of the captain's return, she came out to speak to him. Immediately as she cast her eyes on the prince, for whom she had shed so many tears, she recognized him in his gardener's habit. As for the prince, who trembled in the presence of a king, as he sought her, to whom he was to answer for an imaginary debt, it could not enter into his thoughts that the person whom he so earnestly desired to see stood before him. If the princess had followed the dictates of her inclination, she would have run to him, and, by embracing, discovered herself to him. But she put a constraint on herself, believing that it was for the interest of both that she should act the king a little longer before she made herself known. She contented herself for the present to put him into the hands of an officer, who was then in waiting, charging him to take care of him, and use him well till the next day. When the Princess Badoura had provided for Kummir Al Zummaun, she turned to the captain, whom she was about to reward for the important service he had done her. She commanded another officer to go immediately to take the seal of the warehouse which contained his goods, and gave him a rich diamond, worth much more than the expense he had been at in both his voyages. She also bade him keep the 1,000 pieces of gold she had given for the olivers, telling him she would make up the account with the merchant whom he had brought with him. This done, she returned to the Prince of the Isle of Arabian's apartment, to whom she communicated her joy, praying her to keep the secret still. She told how she intended to manage the discovering of herself to Kummir Al Zummaun, and the resignation of the kingdom to him, adding there was so vast a distance between a gardener, as he would appear to the public, and a great prince, that it might be dangerous to rise him at once from the lowest condition of the people to the highest honor. However, justice might require it should be done. The princess of the Isle of Arabian was so far from betraying her that she rejoiced with her, and entered into the design. The next morning, the Princess of China ordered Kummir Al Zummaun to be conducted early to the bath, and then to be apparelled in the robes of an emir, or governor of a province. She commanded him to be introduced into the council, where his fine person and a majestic air drew upon him the eyes of all the lords present. The Princess Badoura herself was charmed to see him look as lovely as ever, and her pleasure inspired her to speak more warmly in his praise. When she spoke to the council, having ordered the prince to take his seat among the emirs, she addressed them thus: "My lords, Kummir Al Zummaun, whom I have advanced to the same dignity with yourselves, is not unworthy of the place assigned him. I have known enough of him in my travels to answer for him, and I can assure you he will make his merit known to all of you, as well by his valor as by 1,000 other brilliant qualities, and the extent of his genius." The prince was extremely amazed to hear the king of the Isle of Arabian, whom he was so far from taking for women, much less for his dear princess, name him, and declare that he knew him, while he thought himself certain he had never seen him before. He was much more surprised when he heard him praise him so highly. Those praises, however, from the mouth of Majesty did not disconcert him, though he received them with much modesty, as shewed that he deserved them. He prostrated himself before the throne of the king, and rising again, said, "Sire, I want words to express my gratitude to your Majesty for the honor you have done me. I shall do all in my power to render myself worthy of your royal favor." From the council board, the prince was conducted to a palace which the Princess Badoura had ordered to be fitted up for him, where he found the officers and domestics ready to obey his commands, a stable full of fine horses, and everything suitable to the quality of an emir. When he was in his closet, the steward of his household brought him a strong box full of gold for his expenses. The less he could conceive whence his happiness proceeded, the more he wanted, but he never once imagined that he owed it to the Princess of China. 2 or 3 days after, the Princess Badoura, that he might be near her person and in a more distinguished post, made him High Treasurer, which office had lately become vacant. He conducted himself in his new charge with so much integrity, yet obliging everybody, that he not only gained the friendship of the great, but also the affections of the people, by his uprightness and bounty. Kummir Al Zummaun had been the happiest man in the world, to see himself in so high favor with a foreign king as he conceived, and increasing in the esteem of all his subjects, if he had had his princess with him. In the midst of his good fortune he never ceased lamenting her, and grieved that he could hear no tidings of her, especially in a country which she must necessarily have visited in her way to his father's court after their separation. He would have mistrusted something, had the princess still gone by the name of Kummir Al Zummaun, which she took with his habit, but on her accession to the throne she had changed it, and taken that of Amanus, in honor of the old king, her father-in-law. The princess, desiring that her husband should own the discovery of her to herself alone, resolved to put an end to her own torments and his. For she had observed that as often as she discoursed with him about the affairs of office, she heaved such deep sighs as could be addressed to nobody but her, while she herself lived in such a constraint that she could endure it no longer. The Princess Badoura had no sooner formed her resolution in concert with the Princess Khaledan than she the same day took Kummir Al Zummaun aside, saying, "I must talk with you about an affair which requires much consideration, and on which I want your advice, as I do not see how it can be done so conveniently as in the night. Come hither in the evening, and leave word at home not to be waited for. I will take care to provide you a lodging." Kummir Al Zummaun came punctually to the palace at the hour appointed by the princess. She took him with her into the inner apartment, and having told the chief eunuch, who prepared to follow her, that she had no occasion for his service, conducted him into a different apartment from that of the princess Hayatanivos, where she used to sleep. When the prince and princess entered the chamber, she shut the door, and taking the talisman out of a little box, gave it to Kummir Al Zummaun, saying, "It is not long since an astrologer presented me with this talisman. You being skillful in all things, may perhaps tell me its use." Kummir Al Zummaun took the talisman and drew near a lamp to view it. As soon as he recollected it, with an astonishment which gave the princess great pleasure, "Sire," said he to the prince, "your majesty asked me the use of this talisman. Alas, its only purpose is to kill me with grief and despair, if I do not quickly find the most charming and lovely princess in the world to whom it belonged, whose loss it occasioned me by a strange adventure, the recital of which will move your majesty to pity such an unfortunate husband and lover as I am." "You shall tell me the particulars another time," replied the princess. "I knew something of them already. Remain here a little, and I will soon return to you." At these words, she went into her closet, put off her royal turban, and in a few minutes dressed herself in her female attire, and having the gird round her, which she had on the day of their separation, re-entered the chamber. Kummir Al Zummaun immediately recognized his dear princess, ran to her, and tenderly embraced her, exclaiming, "How much am I obliged to the king, who has so agreeably surprised me." "Do not expect to see the king any more," replied the princess, embracing him in her turn, with tears in her eyes. "You see him in me. Sit down, and I will explain this enigma to you." They seated themselves, and the princess related the plan she had formed in the plain where they were encamped the last time they were together. As soon as she perceived, she waited for him to no purpose, how she went through with it till she arrived at the Isle of Aban, where she had been obliged to marry the princess Hayatanivos, and accept of the crown, which King Amanos offered her as a condition of the marriage. How the princess, whose merit she highly extolled, had obliged her to make declaration of her sex, and how she found the talisman in the pots of olivers mingled with the gold dust which she had bought, and how these circumstances had proved the cause of her sending for him from the city of the idolaters. When she had concluded her adventure, she obliged the prince to tell her by what means the talisman had occasioned their separation. He satisfied her inquiries, after which, it growing late, they retired to rest. The Princess Badoura and Kummir Al Zummaun rose next morning as soon as it was light, but the princess would no more put on her royal robes as king. She dressed herself in her female attire, and then sent the chief eunuch to the king Amanos, her father-in-law, to desire he would oblige her by coming to her apartment. When the king entered the chamber, he was amazed at seeing a lady who was unknown to him, and the high treasurer with her, who was not by etiquette permitted to come within the inner palace. He sat down and asked where the king was. The princess answered, "Yesterday I was king, but today I am only princess of China, wife to the true prince Kummir Al Zummaun. If your majesty will have patience to hear our adventures, I hope you will not condemn me for putting an innocent deceit upon you." The king bade her go on, and heard her narrative from beginning to end with astonishment. The princess, on finishing, said to him, "Sir, the women do not easily comply with the liberty assumed by men to have several wives. Yet, if your majesty will consent to give your daughter, the Princess Hayatanivos, in marriage to the prince, I will with all my heart yield up to her the rank and quality of queen, which of right belongs to her, and content myself with the second place. If this precedent were not her due, I will resign it to her, after the obligation I have to her for keeping my secret so generously. If your majesty refer it to her consent, I am sure of that, having already consulted her, and I will pass my word that she will be very well satisfied." King Anamus listened to the princess with astonishment, and when she had done, turned to Kummir Al Zummaun, saying, "Son, since the Princess Badoura, your wife, whom I have all along thought to be my son-in-law, through a deceit of which I cannot complain, assures me that she will divide your bed with my daughter, I would know if you are willing to marry her, and accept of the crown, which the Princess Badoura would deservedly wear, if she did not quit it out of love to you." "Sir," replied Kummir Al Zummaun, "though I desire nothing so earnestly as to see the king my father, yet the obligations I have to your majesty and the Princess Hayatanivos are so weighty, I can refuse her nothing." The prince was then proclaimed king, and married the same day, with all possible demonstrations of joy, and had every reason to be well pleased with the Princess Hayatanivos' beauty, wit, and love for him. The two queens lived together afterwards on the same friendly terms and in the same cordiality as they had done before, both being contented with Kummir Al Zummaun's equal carriage towards them. The next year each brought him a son at the same time, and the birth of the two princes was celebrated with extraordinary rejoicings. The first, whom the Princess Badoura was delivered of, was named Angiad, most illustrious, and the other, born of Queen Hayatanivos, Assad, most virtuous. End of section 27.